What would you do if you inherited nearly 1 million acres and a tax bill big enough to destroy it? That's what the King family faced in 1925. Henrietta King died at 92, leaving an estate appraised at 997,444 acres and 94,347 head of cattle, an empire larger than Rhode Island. Within a few years, Depression beef prices collapsed, and the estate owed roughly $3 million in taxes. Every other great Texas ranch that hit that wall eventually sold. This one didn't. The reason isn't cattle, and it isn't oil, though oil bought the time. It's stranger than either. Let me take you back to where this land was worthless. In 1853, a steamboat captain named Richard King bought a piece of South Texas along Santa Gertrudis Creek, roughly 15,500 acres, in a stretch of country then called the Wild Horse Desert. That name wasn't marketing. The land was cheap because it was considered close to unusable. Scrub, thorn, brutal heat, and almost no reliable surface water. You could look at that ground and see nothing that would keep an animal alive through a dry summer, which is precisely why King could afford so much of it. I want you to sit with that, because it's the hinge the entire story turns on. Every rancher who bought good watered land in the 1850s bought a small amount of it. King bought a defect at scale. The defect was the only reason a steamboat man could assemble a kingdom in a decade. He ran cattle on it anyway. Longhorns, many purchased in Mexico, animals tough enough to walk hundreds of miles to a railhead and survive on bad forage. He bought Brahman bulls as early as 1872. He kept buying land, and he kept his own brand, the Running W, on everything that moved. Then, on April 14th, 1885, Richard King died. By then, the ranch covered more than 600,000 acres. It also carried around $500,000 in debt, which in 1885 was an amount that could take a business apart. Here's what King did in his will, and I don't think he could have known how much it would matter. He left the entire estate to his wife Henrietta, not divided among their 5 children, not carved into fifths, all of it to one person. Keep that in your head. It's the first move in a pattern that took 80 years to complete. Henrietta then made a decision that looks strange on paper. She handed operational control to the ranch's lawyer. Robert Justus Kleberg had been handling King Ranch legal affairs since 1884. He was not a cattleman. He was an attorney who had made himself indispensable in a business drowning in land disputes and title litigation, which in South Texas in that era was most of the business. She made him full-time manager. He married her youngest daughter, Alice, the following year. Now, plenty of people at the time could reasonably have said this was a mistake. The ranch needed a stockman. It had debt, drought exposure, and a labor force spread over hundreds of thousands of acres. What it got was a lawyer. What the lawyer did was start dividing the ranch with fences into manageable units and crossbreeding the Longhorn cow herd with Shorthorn and Hereford bulls. That second decision sounds technical, so let me tell you why it mattered. The Longhorn's great virtue was that it could walk. Once the railroad reached South Texas, nobody needed a cow that could walk to Kansas. They needed a cow that put on weight. The animal that built the ranch had become obsolete on the ranch's own ground. There was also a problem that had nothing to do with the ranch's own management and could have finished it anyway. Texas fever. Cattle from South Texas carried a tick-borne disease that killed northern herds while leaving the southern animals that had grown up with it largely unaffected. Northern states responded with quarantine lines, legal barriers that shut Texas cattle out of the markets where the money was. It didn't matter how good your herd was if your herd was banned. Kleberg's work on tick eradication is one of the more significant contributions the ranch made to the wider Texas cattle industry, and it's a good example of what having a lawyer in charge actually produced. The problem wasn't solved by better stockmanship. It was solved by treating a legal and biological barrier as one obstacle and going after both. By 1895, the debt was gone, and the property had grown to around 650,000 acres. But there was a problem no amount of fencing could solve, and it had been there since 1853. Water. You cannot stock 1,000,000 acres of South Texas on surface water that disappears in August. Cattle will walk themselves thin looking for it, or they'll die within sight of grass they can't use. Every acre King had bought cheap was, in dry years, worth roughly what he'd paid for it. The answer came from underground. Kleberg drilled and hit artesian water, water under natural pressure that rises without pumping. Wells went in across the property, and land that could only be grazed seasonally became land that could be grazed year-round. That single change is what let the ranch pass 1,000,000 acres. Under Kleberg's management, it reached roughly 1,173,000 acres. And I want to slow down here, because 1,000,000 acres is a number that hides people. Land that size doesn't run itself. From the earliest years, the ranch's workforce came substantially from Mexican families, the Quinanos, King's people, some of whose descendants worked the same ground across multiple generations. The 200 riders at Henrietta King's funeral weren't hired for the occasion. That was the workforce. This is also part of why the ranch functioned as a self-contained world. Housing, a commissary, a school, work that passed from father to son. A single fence line on that property could take days to ride. The distances alone forced the ranch to become a settlement rather than a business people commuted to. And here's the consequence nobody plans for. Every acre added, every well drilled, every year the operation grew more valuable, increased the size of the bill that would eventually come due when the woman who owned all of it died. The family also did something most ranchers never get the chance to do. They built the infrastructure around themselves. In 1904, their efforts helped bring the St. Louis, Brownsville, and Mexico Railway through the property, and towns went up along the new track, including Kingsville, which carries the family name and sits at the ranch's edge to this day. Henrietta King donated land and money toward churches, schools, and libraries in a part of Texas that had almost none of them. That matters for a practical reason as much as a civic one. A railroad on your own land changes what your cattle are worth because it removes the cost and weight loss of moving them to somebody else's railhead. Before that happened, the ranch solved the other half of its original problem, not water this time, the cow itself. The imported European breeds that gained weight so well in Kansas struggled badly in South Texas. Heat, humidity, insects, and ticks. Brahman cattle handled the climate but didn't finish the way the market wanted. So the ranch crossed Brahman onto Shorthorn and selected over years for animals that could survive the country and still put on beef. The result was the Santa Gertrudis, named for the creek where Richard King bought his first acres. The breed traces to a foundation sire the ranch called Monkey, and everything that followed was built out from that line through deliberate selection over years, not a lucky cross, but a breeding program with records. In 1940, the United States Department of Agriculture recognized it as the first beef breed developed in the United States. Think about what that actually represents. They had bought land that couldn't support the available cattle. Rather than change the land, they built a different animal. None of it saved them from what happened on March 31st, 1925. Henrietta King died that day, aged 92, on the ranch. At her funeral in Kingsville, an honor guard of 200 vaqueros on horses, branded with the running W, flanked the hearse, and each rider circled the open grave once before leaving. Then the appraisers went to work, and the numbers tell you exactly how large this had become. 997,444 acres of land, not counting what she'd already given her daughter Alice. 94,347 head of cattle, 3,782 horses, 802 mules, assets of roughly $7.1 million against liabilities of about $1.7 million. And in her will was the instruction that should have ended the story. The properties would be divided among her children after a 10-year trusteeship. I need to explain why that phrase is the most important thing in this entire documentary, because on the surface it just sounds like a delay. When a large ranch passes to multiple heirs, they typically receive undivided interests. Nobody owns a specific pasture. Everybody owns a percentage of everything. That works while the heirs agree. It stops working the moment one of them doesn't, because any co-owner can go to court and demand partition, a legal division of the property. And when land can't be split fairly, which is nearly always with a working ranch, the court's remedy is to order it sold and divide the money. That is not a theory. It is the specific mechanism that ended the Waggoner Ranch up in North Texas, where decades of litigation among heirs finished with a court-supervised sale in 1916. It's a version of what happened to the 6666 in 2022, sold whole on the instruction of an estate. The XIT 3 million panhandle acres was deliberately broken up and sold off to farmers because the land was worth more in pieces. The Matador sold in 1951. 4 enormous Texas ranches, 4 different routes, the same destination. And notice that none of those ranches failed as ranches. The Waggoner was productive when it sold. The 6666 was in strong shape when it went to market. The XIT was liquidated because a buyer would pay more per acre for farmland than the cattle operation could ever earn. In every case, the operation was fine and the ownership wasn't. That's the thing this niche of history keeps demonstrating. The threat to a great ranch almost never comes from the weather. It comes from arithmetic, heirs multiplying while the land stays exactly the same size. Henrietta's 10-year trusteeship didn't prevent partition. It postponed it. It bought the family a decade to find another answer. They nearly ran out of time. By 1933, the ranch was in serious trouble, and it had nothing to do with grass or cattle management. The Great Depression had driven beef prices to the lowest levels of the century. Estate taxes from Henrietta's death were reported at around $3 million, an amount the ranch simply did not have, on an operation that was barely profitable in a good year. Bob Kleberg, grandson of Richard King, ranch manager since 1918, and now trustee of the estate, was out of options. And I want to be precise about what trouble meant, because it's easy to hear $3 million and think of it as a big invoice. It wasn't. A tax bill of that size against an operation that was losing money most years is a demand to produce cash the business does not generate and cannot borrow against. In a year when banks were failing and the collateral, land and cattle, was worth less every month, The asset was enormous and almost entirely illiquid. You cannot pay the government in acres. That's the trap that has broken land-rich families for a century, and it's why so many of these stories end with an auctioneer. The obvious solution was sitting right there. Sell land, sell a division, pay the tax, keep the rest. Richard King's standing instruction, repeated in the family for generations, had been never to sell a foot of it, but instructions from dead men: don't pay tax bills. What Kleberg did instead was sell something else entirely. He negotiated with Humble Oil and Refining Company, later Exxon, for exclusive drilling rights across the ranch. The terms are worth understanding precisely because this wasn't a lottery ticket. Humble committed to annual bonus payments large enough to cover the interest on the estate's debts. The ranch received a yearly bonus of 13 cents an acre. And critically, King Ranch retained a 1/8 royalty on the gross proceeds of any oil produced. With interest payments guaranteed, Kleberg consolidated the family's debts under a single first mortgage of $3,223,645. Texas Monthly has reported the arrangement as a loan of about $3.5 million. The figures differ by source, so treat the exact number as approximate. Notice what this deal actually bought: not wealth, not yet. It bought solvency, and it bought time, the same commodity Henrietta's will had bought a decade earlier. Meanwhile, the thing the trusteeship was designed to delay arrived anyway. In 1933, one branch of the family, the Atwoods of Chicago, sued over the trusteeship and the division of the estate. That litigation was not resolved until after the Second World War. Kleberg spent those years buying out more distant heirs where he could, consolidating ownership into his own branch of the family. This is the moment the story could have gone the way of the Waggoners. An estranged heir, a court, a property that can't be split. So here, finally, is the answer to the question we started with. In the mid-1930s, sources give 1934 and 1935, Alice King Kleberg consolidated the ranch property into a corporation with her children as stockholders. That sentence is the whole thing. Let me make it concrete. Before incorporation, an heir who wanted out had one instrument available: a partition suit against the land. After incorporation, that heir owned shares in a company. If they wanted out, they sold the shares. The company still owned the ranch. The fences didn't move. The cattle didn't get sorted into fifths. A dispute that used to be resolved by a judge dividing dirt was now resolved by a transfer of paper. Every other great Texas ranch was, structurally, a piece of land owned by an ever-multiplying group of relatives. King Ranch converted itself into a business that happened to own a piece of land. And with the tax crisis handled and the ownership structure secured, the oil that had been a rescue package turned into an actual income stream. Long-term leases with Humble covered oil and gas rights across roughly 1.15 million acres of King Ranch property. Now the ranch had two businesses running on the same ground, and the one underneath didn't care whether it rained. Understand how unusual that is. A cattle operation in South Texas lives and dies on rainfall it cannot control, prices it cannot set, and a product that takes years to bring to market. Every drought is a decision about whether to buy feed you can't afford or sell animals at the worst possible moment. Royalty income arrives on a schedule that ignores all of it. That's not just extra money, it's a completely different risk profile bolted onto the same acres, and it meant the ranch could absorb a bad cattle year without touching the land. What that money bought was the ability to keep experimenting. Mechanized brush control, better grasses, mineral supplements for herd health, purpose-built corrals for working cattle at scale. It funded a thoroughbred program that produced Assault, the 1946 Triple Crown winner. It funded international expansion with King Ranch operations and partnerships reaching Australia, Brazil, Cuba, Venezuela, and Morocco. And it created the situation the family is still living inside. Here's the cost, and I think it's the most interesting part. A corporation has shareholders. Shareholders are not required to be ranchers. As generations passed, the stock spread across descendants who had never worked a day on the property, who lived in other cities and other states, and who reasonably expected the company to perform like a company. In 1977, King Ranch was placed under the direction of someone who was not a descendant of Richard King. Texas Monthly covered that transition under the title When We Were Kings, and the question it asked was whether the institution could survive a changing of the guard. There's nothing scandalous in that, and it's worth being fair about it. A company that size, with holdings across several countries and businesses ranging from cattle to citrus to energy, genuinely requires professional management. But it does answer a question the family had been avoiding for 40 years. What happens when the people who own the ranch are no longer the people who run it? Read that against 1935 and you get the trade. The corporate structure did exactly what it was built to do. It made the land almost impossible to break apart. It also converted a family into a shareholder register and put professional managers between the descendants and the dirt. There's a harder piece of the record too, and it shouldn't be skipped. The assembly of this ranch in the 19th century involved land acquired from Tejano owners in a period of legal chaos and violence along the border, and those acquisitions have been contested by historians and by descendants of the families involved. A story about how one dynasty held its land is incomplete without acknowledging how the land was gathered in the first place. The commercial adaptations continued. The Running W is now licensed to Ford, appearing on King Ranch Edition F-Series trucks, a brand built for identifying cattle on open range, sold on a pickup tailgate. Hunting leases, farming, and citrus operate alongside the cattle, and the ranch runs a visitor operation and a museum in Kingsville, a working property that also sells access to itself. So come back to 1925 and that appraiser's inventory. Today, King Ranch runs roughly 60,000 head on about 825,000 acres across 6 South Texas counties, still bigger than Rhode Island, though noticeably smaller than the 1,173,000 acres it once covered. Land was sold over the decades. The instruction never to sell a foot did not survive literally. What survived was the core, intact, under one owner, while the Waggoner went to a court-ordered sale. The 6666 went to a group of outside investors, the XIT was cut into farms, and the Matador was sold off in pieces. The reason isn't better cattle, though they built a breed. It isn't the oil, though the oil paid the bill. It's that in the 1930s, this family stopped owning land together and started owning a company together, and a company can be divided 1,000 ways without a single acre changing hands. Here's the question that leaves. The structure protects the land from the heirs. It does not protect the heirs from drifting away from the land. Every generation, the shareholders are further from the ranch, and the ranch is further from the family that built it. The Running W is still on the cattle. It's also on a truck in a dealership parking lot in Ohio. At some point, somebody has to decide which of those is the ranch.